Yes, record on this computer. We're now recording.
Okay, good. Because of it, we need video for your lecture. Thank you. Good. Continue. Sorry. Yeah.
So just a little bit of background about the center, as Tuan described. We are a project of the Michael Dukakis Institute, and our specific mission is to advise governments and international organizations on artificial intelligence and digital policy. We have a global network of experts and scholars in this field. We publish reports, meetings, we organize, we prepare statements. The materials are available at our website, which I invite you to visit. It's caidp.dukakis.org. And just a few words about my own background. In addition to the work with the center, I've been on the faculty at Georgetown Law School here in Washington, D.C. For many years. I teach privacy law and open government, and now the GDPR, which you may know is the privacy law of the European Union. I have degrees from Harvard College, from Stanford Law School, and also from Georgetown, where my focus has been international and comparative law. I've published several books, textbooks, so including Privacy Law and Society, and a collection of materials related to AI policy. I worked recently with the OECD, the international organization in Paris, on the development of the OECD AI policy guidelines for AI. I also helped draft a new framework for AI policy called the Universal Guidelines for AI. So that's a bit of my background and background of the center. We're going to talk today about a substantial report that we did on artificial intelligence and democratic values. And because I understand that many of you have a background in engineering and computer science, I actually wanted to briefly interrupt the original slide presentation and share with you an article that I published in the Communications of the ACM, which many of you may be familiar with. This is a leading publication in computer science. And last year, as I was doing this work in AI policy, they said to me, well, maybe you could tell us a bit about your thoughts regarding the evaluation of national AI policies. And as I say, I think this is relevant for your background because you aren't necessarily lawyers or focused as much on the legal matters with AI, but I do think AI policy has significant implications in the fields of computer science and engineering. And you'll find this online. The report itself, of course, is very long and lots and lots of material, but this column provides with some detail and focus how it is that we undertook the project of writing the report, Artificial Intelligence and Democratic Values. So this would be, a simple way to understand the genesis of the project, and you will find that at the Communications of the ACM. But here we are, and back with our slide presentation. So let me give to you a few of the high points of the report. No doubt you're aware that there have been many studies on AI and ethics. There's a recent summary from the Council of Europe, which indicates that there are perhaps over 340 efforts to create frameworks for AI and ethics. And some of the terms are very familiar across these various ethics frameworks. You see words like fairness and accountability and transparency, human-centric, and so forth. Our analysis was actually a bit different in the sense that we were specifically interested in looking at the policies of governments, separate from the policies of a professional society, perhaps the IEEE or the ACM, or the policies of private companies, whether it was Microsoft or Google or somebody else. Our aim was to examine the policies of governments and to evaluate them. We believe it's the first formal evaluation of this type. We created a series of grades, 12 metrics that we identified, which we considered to be favorable in our assessment of national policies. And based on those 12 metrics, we assigned scores, and we created a ranking system for national governments. And we explained also in our report that the scoring that we used were, as best as they could be, objective standards based on global norms for AI and democratic governance that had already been announced by the OECD and also by the G20 countries. There's been a very important evolution in the development of international frameworks for AI policy, beginning with the OECD in 2019, which established the AI principles and followed afterward by the endorsement of the G20 nations through the AI guidelines, which look very similar. I'll continue through my slides, and then I'll be, very happy, of course, to hear your questions and answer any questions that you may have. This is a little bit more detail on the report, the scope and the assessment. We had to create an objective basis for the countries that we decided to study. We thought it would be, at least in the first year, too difficult, frankly, too much work to do an assessment of all of the nations that might be using AI systems. So we began with the top 25 nations as measured by GDP. There were an additional 5 countries that were nominated because we thought they were pursuing interesting AI projects, and that's how we came up with the 30 countries. As I mentioned earlier, we established 12 metrics, drawing from international legal instruments, including the Universal Guidelines for Human Rights, the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, the OECD guidelines, certain principles of transparency and independence of agency review. We also factored in forward-looking frameworks that we believe are important for the evaluation of AI policies. And this includes, for example, the social contract for the age of AI, a very important declaration from the Boston Global Forum that governments are looking at today, and we considered their adoption or implementation of those principles from the social contract in part of our evaluation. As there were 12 metrics, and the score for each was essentially a 0, a 0.5, or a 1.0, you could imagine the perfect score would then be 12.0. Negative score, or the least good score would be a 0. I should point out that while we established a rating and ranking system at a moment in time, we anticipate that the ratings and rankings will change over time. There could be, progress from some countries. There could be countries that, move backward. And that's, we think, a very good dynamic to evaluate. It isn't our intention to do simply a one-time snapshot of countries' practices and say necessarily this country is doing a better job than that country. What we really want to do is evaluate over time how countries are evolving in their practices with regard to AI policies. So you can think of our initial scoring for 2020 as a starting point that provides a baseline for future evaluation. And then, of course, based on the ratings, we created a ranking system. We grouped countries into 5 tiers, and that provides a easy overview of the analysis and the current position of the countries that we examined. While it's, no doubt the case that there is some subjectivity in all research of this type, and we do discuss toward the end in our analysis of methodology, how we address the various problems of subjectivity. I will say it is a comprehensive report. There were more than 20 researchers, 25 researchers around the globe working on this. The final report is over 100,000 words with 1,000 footnotes. I don't think there's ever been, at least in this field to date, such an extensive analysis. And then when we completed the first draft, we circulated it to outside reviewers because we wanted an independent assessment. And we took into consideration the comments that we had received from the outside reviewers and made some changes and some revisions. And there will be future changes as well to the report. If you happen to read my introduction, I made the point at the beginning of this project that for me, this was actually very similar to work that we had done almost 30 years ago in the early 1990s with the first comparative studies of privacy and human rights around the world. And you know, that report, which began as maybe 30 pages stapled together in the corner, grew over time to, you know, be more than 1,000 pages long and very comprehensive. So we actually look forward to an even more extensive report in the future as our research continues and our network expands. Here are a few of our key findings. As I suggested earlier, the OECD G20 AI guidelines are influential. More than 50 countries have already endorsed these principles and are adopting national laws and policies based on these principles. So that's significant. We were interested to see that AI policies oftentimes follow from national policies on data protection, which concern not only the collection and use of personal data, but also such issues as the transparency or explainability of the algorithm that makes the automated decision about people. You see, this is not a new issue with the emergence of AI. It's an issue that has been central to the development of modern privacy law going back almost 50 years. So it's in this respect not surprising that AI policy would build on the earlier privacy frameworks. We were interested in the so-called red lines, the actual prohibitions for certain AI deployment. And I think this is a very important topic to understand. In many areas of AI use today, there's a lot of discussion on ethics, but rarely have people been prepared to say, you know, perhaps we simply should not go forward with this AI system. There are lots of reasons you might not deploy a system. Maybe you can't establish that it's safe or that it's reliable or that it's provable or that it accomplishes the goal you're seeking to achieve. But of course, if you reach that conclusion about the system and the project that you're involved with, there's a very significant consequence. And the consequence would be to say, this should not go forward. And that's not an easy decision for organizations to make, whether they're private companies or public agencies. Presumably companies and government agencies invest a lot of resources and time and people in these projects. And to reach the conclusion that a project should not go forward would, of course, be a costly decision. Now, one of the ways that organizations are assessing this possibility is through the development of AI impact assessments, which are similar to privacy impact assessments or data protection impact assessments. And the goal is to do the formal evaluation prior to the deployment of the system of the various risks that might arise. And if you undertake that assessment in advance, it may well lead you to the conclusion that, in fact, the deployment of the system doesn't make sense. Anyway, we were very interested in uncovering you know, these types of projects that seem particularly controversial A few, for example, that we describe in our report are facial surveillance. And I use this phrase, facial surveillance, quite purposefully, because of course, facial recognition can have benefits to establish a user identity under the control of the user for opening an iPhone, for example. But in other settings, when facial surveillance or facial recognition is used in public spaces for mass surveillance, then it has a very different consequence. And there are many experts and NGOs and others who have said simply that particular implementation should not be permitted. Similar arguments have been made, for example, with regard to criminal sentencing. Should you allow an algorithm to make a judgment about a person's criminal sentence? And what about an algorithm that is opaque, that produces an outcome that can't be proven? This is a very controversial area of AI use in the United States. Companies have developed these proprietary systems. They have provided evidence that they're very good predictors of future criminal conduct, but they don't actually want to reveal the system that they've developed, because for the private company, that's actually the value of the company. It's their prediction model that has created some value. But of course, if you're the person who's being sentenced by this black box system, you may say, well, I would like to know the basis of this sentence, and my right to know the basis of the sentence should be greater than your right to protect the value of your invention. And then, of course, we see either purposefully or almost, accidentally, private companies and governments are just engaging in extensive scoring of people. And sometimes the basis of the scoring is known, sometimes it's not known. You have Uber drivers in Europe who are protesting the secret scoring that's made of their labor. And they argue that they have the right to know the basis of that scoring. You have governments, including China, that have decided it's appropriate to assign a score to their citizens. Again, these are applications of AI that seem to us very controversial and do raise questions about whether there should be red lines. The other point to make about our findings is that we're still in the early days of AI policy, not the AI field, of course. I'll share with you, I was doing game heuristics for chess and backgammon almost 40 years ago. I wrote some pretty strong programs in my early days. But this field of AI policy concerning government and law is actually very recent. And so we're following closely these developments in anticipation of future actions. So just to share with you the findings as applied to specific countries, and as I said, we anticipate some change over time. We did put Germany in the first tier on the AI policy metrics, noting not only the robust safeguards for data protection, but also the leadership across the European Union on AI policy. There's a second grouping of countries that are making significant progress. The US and AI, I've contributed a lot, and I'm happy to point to some of the successes, but at the same time, we've raised some concerns. We identify, for example, the ability of the public to participate in AI policy decisions as one of the key indicators of a successful national AI policy. And so, for example, in the US, you'll find a lot of, I guess we would call them favorable AI policies, but in our opinion, not a sufficient level yet of public participation. So we hope that would change over time. And we would also hope to see stronger privacy safeguards. We are critical of China in this report, and we focus specifically on certain uses of AI techniques that raise fundamental concerns in terms of facial surveillance, in terms of the tracking of minority groups. We think these applications of AI are very problematic. and you know, if widely adopted, do raise questions about whether the technology is beneficial or whether the technology is actually adverse to the interests of humanity. We presented a series of recommendations. This is for all governments equally, and to the extent that countries make progress on these recommendations, you know, the scores increase, the rankings change, and we do remain optimistic that there will be changes in national AI policies. We think democratic values, and particularly the notions of fairness, accountability, and transparency, are key. Mechanisms for independent oversight. And you know, in the engineering field, I mean, you're constantly testing and evaluating and re-examining, you know, particularly your code, to see the outcomes that a system produces. We think this approach needs to be adopted at the level of law and policy, which is to say that there should be independent mechanisms created through government to evaluate the effectiveness, reliability, and trustworthiness of AI systems. And we actually believe that over the long term, this will be in everyone's benefit. Now, of course, the organizations and the businesses probably don't want this additional burden. It's a form of auditing, and you know, it means more transparency and it means more accountability. But auditing is actually a good practice. And we know from the financial realm that it helps ensure that firms are more reliable and that people can place trust in firms. So this is a way to think of auditing as applied to AI. We are interested in particular in the country's own deployment of AI systems. Oftentimes it's national governments that have the biggest impact on the adoption and character of new technologies. And so governments, in effect, should lead by example. And finally, we do propose a ban, or at least a moratorium, on facial recognition for mass surveillance until there are adequate legal safeguards in place. That's a recommendation, actually, that we're sending on this week to the G20 nations. So just to give you an insight into what we do with a report like this, we have circulated it to key decision makers, the European Union and the United States, the United Nations, G20, and elsewhere. We intend to do an update in 2021 at the end of this year with new ratings and new rankings. So we hope to keep people interested in this conversation. And to learn more, I've included a few more links. I'm happy to make these slides available for you. The key link, caidp.dukakis.org, and then also bostonglobalforum.org. And you'll find a lot of the materials that we've prepared there, including our weekly updates. So we are keeping all of this going. Great. So let me stop there and take your questions and address any other issues you might like to raise.
Hello. I've quickly read your report yesterday, and it was very interesting because I really like systematization and categorization, and it's very impressive. What do you think? What one can we do next? Because it's great that you are able to evaluate different countries and their actions, but simply knowing that, for example, China is not doing so great, maybe it's not enough. And do you have any plans, for example, how you can use your results to maybe correct the laws or to ban some international cooperation like you've mentioned in the part about Israel, that Microsoft stopped participating in the AI work because they're not sure that it's ethical. However, they didn't find that it's unethical. To say it quickly, how do you think how we can use your results to maybe stimulate those countries who are not doing so well to change their approach?
It's a very good question. It's actually probably for us one of the key questions because, of course, we are trying to influence the policies and practices of national governments. And the first part of my answer is we need precise ways to measure AI policies. Because as you know, at the policy level, people talk in general terms. They'll say, we are committed to AI fairness, we are committed to AI transparency, but we need the ability to actually evaluate those statements. So again, the first part of the answer is to be precise and then to look for an evaluation. I think the second part of the answer is to look at well-established international frameworks and use those frameworks to move countries toward better practices. So if it's simply our opinion about what a country should do, I think they could ignore us. But if we can point to the text of the OECD AI principles, the fact that countries have made these commitments, have made commitments to the G20 guidelines, then you see it's actually a much more interesting conversation, because now it's not simply our opinion about what a country should do. It is actually the responsibility of the country through its own actions and its own commitments to others about what it should do. And I do believe that one of our great accomplishments this year was to make that connection. Before people understood that there were policy frameworks that countries had committed to, it was, you know, almost like a fog or cloud. I mean, you could say almost anything about AI policy, and it was very difficult to tell whether that was accurate. But we can say precisely today which principles countries have committed to. And so we can then ask the question, are they upholding their commitments?
Yes, thank you. And as I understood, you are planning to count the country's score every year. And so, for example, in 10 years, we will be able to see the dynamics, some trends. And I think it may be even more important than just this year's numbers, because country may, for example, have some good laws this year, but the next year they can forget about all laws and do something very unethical. So I think your work will be even more important in 10 years if we will be able to see the trends where the country is going.
Right. So thank you for that comment, because that is also key to our methodology. You know, I anticipate that some countries will object that they received a low score, and they'll say, well, there's a preference for another country. I mean, whatever their views may be, I don't think that would be too surprising. But to me, what will be more interesting is what happens over time. Because if we can agree as to the measures for good AI policy and look from one year to the next, you know, did you implement the G20 guidelines? Have you created a legal right of transparency? We have the opportunity for a meaningful, objective discussion, which is not so political. You see, the problem, of course, with all of these types of evaluations is that you can be very political, and that's really not our goal. If the countries that we are critical of this year improve their practices, we'll be happy about that. And the scores rise and the rankings change. And if the countries that we gave high scores to, as you say, do unethical things, their scores will drop. And I think this is maybe the best approach in the field of public policy when you're trying to have an influence.
Yes, thank you. It will be very interesting to see the trends, I think.
Yes, I think so too. Does anyone else have a question?
If nobody wants, I thought that I forgot to ask. Do you plan to evaluate the? Do you plan? I don't know even what is more interesting, to study more countries, or maybe to study not countries but some regions of the countries, because in the United States, different, for example, different states can have very different laws, and for example, in Russia, we have Moscow with where I think everything is implemented, and I live in St. Petersburg, and I can't, the second city of Russia, but I can't say that I see any AI implementations. So I think that the Russian score will be very difficult, very different if you would count it without Moscow.
Yeah.
And so on the other hand, on the one hand, you can study more countries, and on the other hand, you can study the same countries, but on the lower level. And what are your plans?
Yes. So first of all, the second point you raised actually did come up as we were putting together the report. And we did notice, you have national governments, but you also have regional or state level governments, and they can adopt their own policies on AI. And you're absolutely right. I mean, what's happened in the United States is quite remarkable, which is to say, we have no formal statement through the federal government about facial surveillance. But many prominent cities, San Francisco and Boston, for example, have actually prohibited the use of facial surveillance by the police. So when we were doing the evaluation for the US, we wrote about this because we thought it was significant. But in terms of our methodology, we stayed focused on the federal government and said, overall, what is the law and policy for the United States as a country, which is the same approach, by the way, we took elsewhere. I mean, Germany is interesting, for example, because the Landen have different laws for data protection and for AI, and different consequences. So we might write about a particular development in Hamburg, for example, but we still have to evaluate the country as a whole, which is what we will continue to do. So that's just a research strategy to acknowledge the regional developments, but to maintain the overall methodology. The second question, which you ask, is also very good, is how, what are the next steps? I mean, do we revise the methodology? Do we add more countries? My experience, first of all, is that it's very important once you establish a methodology to maintain it. We have a long discussion at the end of the report about why we chose the 12 questions we did, and we're prepared to defend that. Someone may come along later and say, well, of course, you've missed this question, or that question is a little unclear. And they could, of course, be right. But to maintain an effective study over time, we need to keep the questions fixed over time so that we're not skewing the outcomes of the data we receive. So we're going to stay with the questions that we established. As for the countries, yes, I think we should begin to expand. And as our research network grows, we do anticipate adding more countries. Again, from the objective methodology approach, we need a justification for why we selected particular countries. We don't want someone to say, well, you know, you picked that country because you wanted to make a criticism, or you picked that country because you like that country. In each step of a good study, you want a good explanation for why you're asking the questions you are and why you're gathering the data you are. So very simply, this year we took the top 25 by GDP. Maybe next year, or last year we took the top 25 by GDP. Maybe this year we take the top 30 or the top 40 by GDP. And if anyone said to us, so why did you add this country? We can say, well, that's, you know, one of the top 40. That would be our answer.
Yes, thank you.
Hello, may I ask a questions? I'm not completely sure. Maybe I don't understand you, but what can we do if some countries don't not agree with this document?
Well, we like criticism, actually. I think if countries have a good criticism, you know, we can make changes, but it has to be, you know, a good criticism and a fair criticism. It can't simply be a country that says, well, we don't like the fact that we received a lower score. That's, you know, if the score is correct, the score stays unchanged. Now, if a country comes back and says to us, well, you reported that we don't have a national AI strategy, but actually we do have a national AI strategy, and here's the link to our national AI strategy. Now, in that circumstance, we've made a mistake, an objective mistake, and the report should be revised to more accurately reflect that country's national AI strategy. And we would acknowledge that in the next edition of the report. But you see, this is also the benefit when you undertake a project like this. If you commit to accuracy and objectivity and also ongoing publication, you can take account of these errors and fix them over time. But I understand your question. I mean, if, you know, the fact that someone is not happy with our evaluation would not be a basis for us to change it. If we've made a mistake, we will correct the mistake. So is that a fair answer?
Oh, okay, thank you, I understand.
Well, thank you. Listen, if there are no other questions, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I hope the report is interesting to you. As I said, I appreciate that you may not be studying law, but of course this field of AI has enormous implications for public policy and the actions of governments. And what we hope our report has accomplished is to begin to provide a basic framework building on objective metrics to evaluate countries' practices and to encourage all countries to move toward better practices for artificial intelligence. And, you know, of course, we believe that this will provide significant benefit as countries become more dependent on AI techniques.
Any student have a question more, or we can finish?
It seems like we can finish.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for your lecture and recommendation for AI and digital policy and law in the world today. And we hope we have continued exchange to discuss, students have chance to discuss with you more by email, and we can. And I think there are many challenge for the world need today. This is a international law and consensus in AI and digital policy, and that's a very threat for future of the world and danger for the world if we don't have that. And our work in Boston Global Forum, Michael Dukakis Institute, and directly is a Center for AI and Digital Policy, is try to solve that issue, and we hope that our students can join, and ETU Leti can join with us to build this, and we have many events, and that is homework for our students that follow with the lecture about AI International Accord of Prime Minister Zlatko Lagumziza, and this lecture about law and regulation and policy in AI and digital. So we would like to get your research and answer question how we can convince leaders and special interest government join and discuss and consensus with international laws in AI. Yes, that is the homework for our students. Research and feedback after 2 weeks. Yeah, please send me after 2 weeks about your answer and your solution. Yes, in this program we educate leaders, so we try to give students opportunities to practice as a leader and thinking as a leader to solve the issue. And this is a very special and very important issue and very challenge for the world today. So we hope the AIWS leadership master program students as St. Petersburg very serious and spend time to answer this question. Yeah. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you for Popov Institute for great collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank Mark again. Great lecture. Thank you.
Thank you all. Nice to speak with you.